Next news. Breaking news.
Right now, the Cuban regime may have just said the quiet part out loud. In its most ominous warning yet, Havana is now openly talking like a U.S. intervention under President Trump is no longer some distant fantasy, but a real possibility they feel forced to address in public. That alone should get every American's attention. Cuba's collapsing. The lights are going out, food is scarce, and the island sits just 90 miles from Florida. Then came the line that changed everything. The foreign minister warning of a bloodbath on both sides. Why would a regime say that unless it believes pressure from Trump is becoming very, very real? See, here's why this matters. Because for decades, Cuba was treated like a frozen relic of the Cold War, ugly, repressive, anti-American, but static. Not anymore. Under the Trump administration, the conversations moved from tired diplomatic theater to something far more serious: national security. Secretary Marco Rubio is making it clear that Cuba is not just a humanitarian story, it's a failed communist state parked beside key Gulf shipping lanes, near American energy infrastructure, and inside the immediate strategic orbit of the United States. Senator Rick Scott's saying the same thing, warning that this regime is aligned with Russia, Communist China, Iran, and Hezbollah. That's not a minor nuisance. That is a threat sitting right off our coast, and after the pressure campaign that reshaped the regional chessboard in Venezuela, Havana clearly understands the rules may have changed. Blackouts, shortages, unrest, migration, all of it now looks less like business as usual and more like a regime entering its most dangerous phase in decades. And that's why the bloodbath line is not rhetoric, it's fear. And as we watch systems fail under corrupt regimes, it's also worth remembering how much damage can happen when people ignore real solutions that actually help the body recover and function better. Now, you've probably seen the clip of Joe Rogan with Mel Gibson talking about people close to them facing serious health struggles and then seeing dramatic turnarounds. Rogan mentions light-based therapies working at the cellular level. Gibson says it plain, the stuff works. And that hit home for me because I watched something very similar in my own house. My wife dealt with constant discomfort and anxiety for a long time, and when we started learning more, it changed how we looked at recovery, and that's why I want you to check out Red Light Therapy from Jonathan Otto at myredlight.com. If you've been curious, now is the time. Use NNN25 for individual items or NNN30 for bundles. Go to myredlight.com and see why so many people are finally paying attention. Now back to Cuba, because what the regime said next tells you this pressure campaign is hitting a nerve. See, this is the part the corporate media still does not want to say out loud. Whether or not any military option is imminent, Havana is behaving like the possibility has become credible under President Trump. See, that is the news. Add in reports that U.S. troops are in place to strike Cuba, and suddenly every regime official, every blackout, every protest takes on a very different meaning. Then layer on Treasury Secretary Bissett saying sanctions could go up or down depending on the regime's behavior. And you could see the squeeze is tightening from multiple directions at once. Now listen to this. Cuba Foreign Minister warns if Trump invades, there will be a bloodbath on both sides.
To send a message to the American people. I'm doing my best on this way, because whenever the American people has been informed on basis of a truthful and objective information, they act in the good way. They are in the right side of history.
And specifically, he seemed interested in reaching young Americans because he says that if there is some kind of U.S. attack on Cuba, a military action of some kind, he used the word bloodbath. There will be a bloodbath on both sides, and he said that it would cost Americans, young Americans' lives if the Trump administration were to move to do this, Anna.
The Trump administration.
That was from MS Now. So Cuba's foreign minister isn't calming anything down, openly warning Trump about a bloodbath. Now Political reports the U.S. already has troops in place to strike Cuba. That's the headline on Politico. U.S. has the troops in place to attack Cuba. Pentagon puts the building blocks in place. So the threat gets a lot more serious. The military pieces are already on the board. Next, the bigger question, why Cuba matters so much to U.S. security. 90 miles off to Florida. Cuba's 90 miles off Florida, sits astride key shipping lanes for U.S. Gulf trade. Right now, the island is in free fall, economy collapsing. Here, check this out.
Cuba's current collapse become one of Donald Trump's most important geopolitical challenges in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba and the United States have shared a long and deeply strategic history. As early as 1818, the United States developed major trade relations with Cuba while the island was still under Spanish control. By 1823, the Monroe Doctrine made removing European influence from Cuba part of America's long-term strategic vision. The United States even offered to buy Cuba from Spain in 1854 for $130 million. Then, in 1898, America fought Spain in the Spanish-American War and took control of Cuba along with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba remained under U.S. military occupation until 1902, and Washington maintained deep influence over the island for decades afterward. That influence continued until Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 transformed Cuba into a Soviet ally. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the moment the United States and Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than at almost any other point in the Cold War. And the reason Cuba mattered so much was geography. The island sits only about 90 miles from Florida. The narrow maritime gap between Cuba and the Florida Keys became one of America's biggest strategic vulnerabilities because between 40% and half of U.S. waterborne trade connected to Gulf ports passes through nearby shipping lanes. If a hostile power ever blocked those routes with naval forces or mines, the economic impact on the United States could be massive. That is why American presidents, from James Monroe to John F. Kennedy, treated Cuba as a critical national security issue. And now Donald Trump appears to be following that same tradition. Trump's current strategy increasingly focuses on strengthening American influence across the Western Hemisphere while reducing long-term commitments in other regions. That is partly why Venezuela became so important. According to reports, when the United States removed Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro earlier this year, Cuban troops were reportedly protecting him in Caracas. For years, Cuba depended heavily on Venezuelan oil shipments in exchange for intelligence and security support. But now that system is collapsing. Cuba is facing severe shortages of food, fuel, and electricity. Blackouts are spreading across the island while the economy continues deteriorating under sanctions, corruption, and decades of internal mismanagement. At the same time, Washington fears that a collapsing Cuba could become increasingly connected to criminal organizations, foreign intelligence networks, and hostile powers operating close to the American mainland. And this is where the story becomes larger than Cuba itself. Reports say the head of the CIA recently traveled to Cuba carrying a proposal involving roughly $100 million.
So, you have a collapsing communist state sitting on America's doorstep along major trade routes. Now shift to the useful idiots on the left because Hassan Piker's Cuba trip is facing real scrutiny over whether it broke humanitarian trade rules. The claim: Hassan went to Cuba on humanitarian grounds. Truth: he likely violated the very restrictions that make humanitarian travel legal. Listen to this from Crowder.
Get to the first claim, and it's that Hassan was really there on humanitarian grounds.
Last month, I took the opportunity to go as a part of a humanitarian mission to bring aid that my government won't. I'd be accompanying Progressive International alongside hundreds of others from around the world. Activists, journalists, artists, and politicians will be coming to the island by boat and plane to deliver over 40 tons of necessary supplies, food, medicine, and medical equipment.
Makes him look to be like such a great guy. He's going to go there and help some people and be fantastic. Well, here's the truth. Hassan and his group violated humanitarian restrictions. So he specifically said he went to expose what the United States government has done to the Cuban population. Watch him.
What's up, guys? I'm Hassan Piker. I'm here in Havana, Cuba, right now on a humanitarian aid mission alongside numerous other organizations, including but not limited to the DSA. And
Democratic Socialists of America.
My goal here today is to bring awareness to what my government, the United States of America, has done to the Cuban population.
See, didn't make it up. Words came right out of his own mouth. So this case gets pretty easy to prove pretty quickly. We'll see if they can actually make the case or not. But each humanitarian traveler must engage in these kinds of activities that I'm going to list below, right?
And only,
exactly. So these are the rules and restrictions when you're going to a place like Cuba. A full-time schedule of activities that enhance contact with the Cuban people, support civil society in Cuba, or promote the Cuban people's independence from Cuban authorities. Do you think Hassan Piker did any of those things?
So, while the regime falls apart, left-wing influencers are running cover for it. Here's a blunt reality check after Cuba's foreign minister tried the usual script of lies, blames, and threats on U.S. television. This is peak communist behavior.
The Cuban foreign minister's first ever sit-down interview with Fox News. We wanted to talk to him now because the relationship is at this inflection point where the U.S. and Cuba could very well go to war in the near future. I had expected Bruno Rodriguez to ratchet down the temperature in this interview with the Trump administration, but he went in a different direction. Take a listen. Secretary Rubio made a video last week where he spoke to the Cuban people directly, and he said the real reason for your suffering right now is because the Cuban regime has plundered all of your country's resources.
En la calle se pregunta.
Well, people are in the streets wondering if the Secretary of State really knows what is going on in this world. In all areas, however, he lies. He lies on and on. He continuously intends to deceive the public opinion in the U.S., the U.S. Congress, and the international community.
The Cuban people in crisis now with nationwide blackouts, a food and fuel shortage, and a teetering economy. Military intervention by the U.S. right now, for many of them, would be a worst-case scenario. It almost sounds, Mr. Minister, like you feel some kind of military conflict between the U.S. and Cuba is inevitable. Is that the case?
What would be the benefits for us taxpayers with a war near by its coasts? What would be the benefit for it to the national interest of the U.S.? I also appeal to the Congress of the United States in order to prevent what would be a catastrophic mistake that would cause a bloodbath and a real humanitarian catastrophe.
It was, Dana, very eye-opening to sit there and listen to him explain to me in great detail why the suffering of the Cuban people right now is entirely the Trump administration's fault. We've heard him say it before on social media, but hearing it, face to face was a different matter. Dana, I bet.
Yeah, it's Trump's fault, sure. So they're just going to blame America, threaten chaos, pretend communism didn't wreck the island, but Rick Scott cuts right through it, warning this anti-American regime is tied to Russia, China, and Hezbollah.
Scott has been calling for criminal charges against Cuba's aging former leader for some time now. In the meantime, a Tampa Democrat would like to see more lawmakers focused on kitchen table issues instead. The situation when it comes to Cuba, what does that mean for those who aren't Cuban Americans, especially in Tampa Bay?
Well, you're going to be safer. Right now, think about 90 miles off our coast, okay? You've got a regime that hates us, that are friends with Russia, Communist China, Hezbollah, Iran.
Senator Scott says that's why he supports an indictment against the 94-year-old former Cuban leader who he believes still has great influence in the Latin American country.
So Scott making the national security case. It's not just a Cuba story. It's America First issue. Now Marco Rubio goes even harder, calling the regime what it is, incompetent communists.
Cuba's in a lot of trouble because, unfortunately, for them, it's run by a bunch of incompetent communists. And being communist is bad. Being an incompetent communist is like the worst. And but the country's been taken over by this company called Gaesa that basically controls 70% of the economy. None of the money in that company goes to help the Cuban people, none of it. So we'll be talking to them, we'll be working on it. We want something good for the Cuban people, and hopefully there'll be a good outcome there for them. There needs to be. It's 90 miles from our shores, and having it a failed state 90 miles from our shores is a threat to the national security of the United States.
So Rubio says the Cuban people are trapped by a failed communist regime. Next, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent lays out the pressure campaign, saying sanctions can go up or down.
Mr. Secretary, how effective do you believe the current Treasury restrictions have been in pressuring the Cuban government? And also, if you're in the room when those talks are being held, are there any plans to either tighten the sanctions or to ease the sanctions against the Cuban government to get some type of change?
Again, that's going to be up to the Cuban government. That they can go up, they can go down. That we've tried to get humanitarian aid in, and the regime rejected it. So because they wanted to go through their corrupt system. So they could go up, they could go down. It's carrot and stick. Secretary Rubio doing a fantastic job of managing this process, and we at Treasury are working with him. So, in the red.
So the message from Treasury is simple: cooperate and relief as possible. Keep playing games and screws tight. And Rubio follows up, schooling the fake news.
Let me clarify something for you. Our sanctions are against a company named Gaesa. Yeah. Okay. This is a holding company set up by generals in Cuba that has generated billions of dollars of revenue, none of which benefits the Cuban people. Not 1 cent of it benefits the Cuban people. You understand this, right? I don't know if you know this. There's the Cuban government, and they have a budget, and then there's this private company that has more money than the government does. None of the money in that company goes to build a single road, a single bridge, provide a single grain of rice to a single Cuban, other than the people that are part of Gaesa. So that's what we're sanctioning, is a company that basically is taking anything that makes money in Cuba and illegally putting it into the pockets of a few regime insiders. So that's not sanctions on the Cuban people, because the Cuban people don't benefit from Gaesa. It's a sanction against this company that is stealing from the Cuban people to the benefit of a few. And we didn't discuss those sanctions yesterday, but we imposed them yesterday, and we're going to be doing more, by the way.
We're going to be doing more. And that crackdown may already hitting home, because Hassan Piker is panicking after the Treasury subpoenas tied to aid for communist Cuba.
Hassan Piker might be in real trouble for visiting Cuba in March, where he filmed what looks like a propaganda video for the regime.
I'm here in Havana, Cuba, right now on a humanitarian aid mission. My goal here today is to bring awareness to what my government, the United States of America, has done to the Cuban population. One of the most ridiculous embargoes of all time that has only gotten more deadly as time has gone on.
Yeah, now federal officials have subpoenaed Piker as part of a wider investigation into violations of U.S. laws and sanctions, which prohibits supporting Cuba's communist regime. Piker responded today saying it's, quote, not great and BS and other things. This comes as the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier recently entered the Caribbean, and the DOJ indicted Raul Castro. Joining us now is senior editor of Investigation.
So we have carrier groups off the coast of Cuba now. Castro's been indicted. We've seen this play out before. And now where is Nicolas Maduro? So what does it all really mean? It means the Cuban regime is no longer posturing from a position of confidence. It's signaling vulnerability. Rubio has boxed the issue purposely. These sanctions target Gaesa, the regime's money machine, not the Cuban people. Bessent says the administration even tried humanitarian aid, and the communists rejected it unless it flowed through their corrupt pipeline. See, that exposes the lie. Havana does not fear American aggression nearly as much as it fears losing control. And when a communist foreign minister starts publicly warning young Americans they could die in a bloodbath, that sounds less like strength and more like panic. The Trump administration has made one thing unmistakable. A hostile failed state 90 miles from our shores will not be ignored forever. So the takeaway is quite simple. Cuba is not just another foreign policy file collecting dust in some bureaucrat's drawer. Under President Trump, it's become a live America first security issue. A collapsing communist regime, hostile to the United States, tied to our enemies and positioned right off of Florida, is not something serious leaders can shrug off. And that's why Rubio and the administration are speaking so directly, and that is why Havana is suddenly sounding scared. The bloodbath warning was meant to intimidate Americans. Instead, it revealed that the regime believes that the old rules are over. Good. The Cuban people deserve freedom, not another generation of communist theft and misery. If you agree the Trump administration must keep maximum pressure on Havana, share this report and sound off in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to the Next News Network for the stories the legacy media refuses to tell you straight. Yes or no, should President Trump tighten the screws on Cuba even more? Let's have a conversation on this. And before you leave, text those 2 words to the number on the screen, raw feed, to 844-840-4963. That's how we bypass the algorithm and get you notifications when YouTube fails. And I want to celebrate America 250 with you. So why don't you pick out some gear below this video and support the work that we're doing here.
The system controls information. Information control is power. They don't want you to see this. The truth only survives together. They don't want this shared. Share this now.